When the Saturn myth was introduced by David Talbot in 1980, the interdisciplinary scope of modern investigations into questions of solar system history was significantly widened. The basic Saturnian polar alignment model has been revised and expanded over the ensuing years, and alternative Velikovskian scenarios have been proposed and extensively elaborated. In the meantime, many of Velikovsky's earlier predictions regarding the stellar nature of both Saturn and Jupiter have been consistently affirmed by observations in radio, infrared, X-ray, and ultraviolet imaging. Yet Velikovsky never sketched more than the barest outlines of Jupiter's career, and most Saturnian models since have largely downplayed or neglected to account for Jupiter's predominance in the mytho-historical record. The Saturn myth, however, is not the only modern reconstruction of solar system history to evoke the catastrophic planet-god dramas of ancient myth. Recent astrophysical speculations have increasingly drawn attention to Jupiter's starring role in organizing, harmonizing, and maintaining the dynamic stability of the solar system. The most notable of these, the Nice model, offers a compelling description of the solar system's cataclysmic prehistory that endeavors to account for many of our system's often overlooked mysteries. Like the Saturn myth, the Nice model's reconstruction of events suggests that all planets were once in a closer, more compact configuration close to the Sun, before an encounter between Jupiter and Saturn violently separated them all across vast distances. The Nice model itself has evolved over the last 10 years, and now includes a destructive jumping Jupiter scenario, in which additional interactions between the planets triggered system-wide instabilities that eventually led to the planet's nearly circular orbits where we find them today. What follows is an abbreviated condensation of a large-scale work in progress that compares cosmologies new and old in an attempt to properly situate Jupiter in relation to Proto-Saturn and the Saturnian polar configuration, the breakup of the Golden Age cosmic order, and the conversion of both Jupiter and Saturn from shining dwarf stars to dim gas giants. It includes an overview of major Jovian motifs recalled worldwide, giving emphasis to correlations in the Kabbalah, the traditional mythology of the Jews behind both Old and New Testaments. It also incorporates a thorough review of the Nice model's strikingly similar version of events, including references to Uranus and Neptune as active players in the cosmological drama. All in all, what follows is a preview of a more comprehensive reconstruction yet to come that will unite the myths surrounding Jupiter and Saturn with the observations of modern astronomy, archaeology, and a growing number of interdisciplinary fields of study. Along the way, we shall meet a handful of Jovian alter egos from around the world, including Zeus, Baal, Indra, Marduk, Hadad, Amun-Re, Thor, Teshub, Bolontiku, Ninurta, and Ningirsu. Luminous details conserved across cultures in parallel patterns will help us establish a visual vocabulary that clearly denotes and differentiates Jovian references and associations previously obscured by Saturnian misidentifications. As old erroneous planetary identifications are laid to rest, a tighter chronology of planetary events may be established. And as the myths surrounding Jupiter and Saturn come to be viewed in proper perspective, as pre-literate cultural memories of actual historical circumstances, our modern-day beliefs, taboos, and superstitions, long held over from former ages of catastrophe, might also be seen in a new light. An earlier binary arrangement of the solar system is widely speculated to have been dominated by Proto-Jupiter and the Sun. An ancient satellite sharing a common barycenter with the Sun, Proto-Jupiter was likely comparable to a sub-brown dwarf star and may have been, in an inflated hot phase of development at this time. So-called hot Jupiters, giant planets with masses comparable to Jupiter, orbiting extremely close to their host stars, are quite numerous in nearby star systems. In light of the abundance of these hot Jupiters, it was recently proposed that Jupiter likewise formed in the innermost parts of the primeval solar system. While the Jupiter we know has since cooled off and is now parked safely far away, the very fact that hot Jupiters exist in other systems at all is very real and remarkable, and suggests that the bodies in our solar system were not necessarily formed where we find them today. Indeed, an unresolved issue long besetting the Nice model is its inability to account for Saturn's relatively late arrival in the context of Jupiter's early formation and evolvement. Simulations consistently suggest that Saturn must have been either strangely absent or relatively far removed at this time. Cicero famously ascribed an ancient, wide-ranging, boundless course to Saturn that eventually necessitated Jupiter's intervention. While the actual beginning of the drama is difficult to pinpoint, there was eventually a point at which the two giants approached each other closely. Echoing Ralph Jurgen's suggestion that Saturn was the invading star to a Sun-Jupiter binary, modern cosmologists now seem to concur. Initially far away, Saturn swiftly approached Jupiter, accelerating exponentially in a runaway migration towards the Sun. Perhaps Proto-Saturn was initially captured by the Sun from beyond heliopause, or perhaps Proto-Saturn had been ejected into a far-ranging solar orbit by an earlier interplanetary encounter, eventually swinging back around to perihelion like a comet, converging on Proto-Jupiter and the Sun. No matter how its inbound trajectory was originally initiated, Proto-Saturn would possess an accumulated charge potential befitting colder, more distant reaches of space. As such, Proto-Saturn would be likely to sport a preponderance of positive voltage with respect to the relatively low-voltage Sun-Jupiter binary. Thus, Proto-Saturn would eventually be captured by Jupiter and the Sun simply because their opposite charges would attract and draw them closer and closer together. Proto-Saturn's boundless course was likely reduced by a sequence of electric shocks delivered by remote plasmasphere contacts with Proto-Jupiter during great conjunctions. As soon as their plasmaspheres made contact along the solar current sheet at the same ecliptic longitude, Saturn's runaway migration would come to a sudden violent halt. Because of the sheer extent of their plasmaspheres, it wouldn't be necessary for Jupiter and Saturn to be extremely close to make electrical contact. And because of their unbalanced opposing charges, such contacts would be electromagnetically attractive, capturing Jupiter and Saturn into a series of progressively converging mean motion resonances. In the context of the scenario outlined here, mean motion resonances are essentially a mathematical method of modeling recurrent Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions during various phases of their convergence. These resonances are the consonant intervals that make up the famed Pythagorean music of the spheres. For Jupiter and Saturn to cross from one resonance to another, however, would require both bodies to be aligned parallel to the ecliptic during a great conjunction. The sudden shock of the electric field established between the two would then modulate the orbits of both bodies simultaneously, inducing a virtual jump from one resonance to the next. Simulations suggest that Jupiter and Saturn moved in opposite directions, that is, they jumped toward each other. Jupiter jumped further away from the Sun each time Saturn jumped closer in. Jupiter's orbit expanded as Saturn's diminished. Jupiter's spin rate accelerated as Saturn's slowed. And each time this occurred, Jupiter may have intermittently cooled off as Saturn progressively warmed up. The Saturnist model of Proto-Saturn, as an extrasolar interloper with a grossly mismatched charge potential, hence fills a distinct narrative void in the Nice model, which cannot otherwise account for the initial attraction between the giants, nor make concrete sense of the ensuing series of equilibrium events that drew them closer and closer together. Indeed, in anyone's reconstruction, this early condition of attractive forces seems to be the only way to effectively account for the so-called fundamental drawback with all theories based on a Jupiter-Saturn encounter, the supposed inability to answer how Jupiter and Saturn came to have intersecting orbits in the first place. During the same era, equatorial moons orbiting the giant planets may have been displaced when Jupiter and Saturn jumped into tighter resonances. More massive satellites would be removed more quickly than less massive ones. This might suggest that Earth and other terrestrial worlds were first ejected from equatorial orbit around Saturn prior to recapture as Saturnian companion planets. The architecture of the solar system undeniably bears evidence that Jupiter and Saturn may have been closer to each other in the past. Possibly they were close for a long period of time, passing near one another as they traveled along orbital paths quite dissimilar to those of today. In such close proximity to the Sun, great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn would not only excite each other's eccentricities, but also significantly offset the Sun from the center of the solar system. Periodic accelerations of Saturn toward Jupiter and the Sun during resonance crossings would, as such, perturb, excite, and/or kick the orbits, inclinations, and eccentricities of their displaced moons, as well as those of any other nearby planets, or sub-dwarf stars. Worlds with an opposing negative electrical potential with respect to Saturn would be attracted into resonant alignment during these close encounters. Eventually several planets, including Earth, Venus, and Mars, were steered and captured into an interplanetary configuration centered on Saturn. As planets locked in polar resonance with Saturn, they were simultaneously trapped in a second-order resonance with Jupiter and with each other. The Nice model suggests that when the system naturally evolved into a configuration in which the giant planets were locked in a quadruple resonance, the planets had to move in parallel to preserve the resonant configuration. All in all, according to David Talbot, the entire planetary configuration moved through a gaseous envelope extending perhaps several million miles from Jupiter. Jupiter was the apparent source of an interplanetary vortex within the gaseous envelope, a vortex powerful enough to bring the participating planets into alignment and to maintain the alignment in the face of the natural forces working against it. Incorporating all other gods who came near, Hesiod said, Kronos swallowed all his children but Zeus, intending to prevent the kingship of the gods from passing to any other of the majestic sons of heaven. Nice models and Saturnian scenarios alike have proposed that Uranus and Neptune also became integral components in the temporary stability of the planet's multi-resonant configuration. Inside the configurations encompassing magnetopause, the fixed stars would have been obscured by a cloudy, aurora-like phosphorescence. At the apex of this gloomy or rainy cave-like canopy stood the large central sun-like disk of hot, inflated proto-Saturn. Fragmentary memories worldwide similarly recall giant primordial figures embodying the whole of heaven, or indeed the whole of creation. This phase appears to be synonymous with the protoplanetary Saturn Nebula recalled in a variety of esoteric lore as the primeval state of our solar system and the abode of the gods of former times at the top of the world. Talbot has conjectured that Jupiter was originally hidden behind Saturn, It is here proposed that this was indeed true for a good portion of the Saturnian Golden Age. Because Earth appears to have been the furthest body below the conjoined orbits of the other Saturnian planets, Earth would have been a considerable distance vertically below Jupiter also. In such an arrangement, Earth and its synchronous Saturnian companions would pass by Jupiter roughly once with every yearly revolution around the Sun. A visually distorted Jupiter may have been occasionally visible in the north skies when Jupiter and Saturn were near conjunction. Under such conditions, Jupiter would have appeared as a bright upturned crescent, horn, or sickle backlit by the sun. On one particularly unforgettable occasion, as a result of the extreme compactness of the system, the planetary orbits became chaotic and began to intersect. A great conjunction superimposed the electric fields of Jupiter and Saturn, causing violent perturbations and huge tidal effects in each other's atmospheres. A scenario of global dynamical instability began to unfold. Because of their extreme voltage differential, the shock impulse pervading their shared electric field again exerted an attractive force between the two, but this time at a closer proximity than ever before. The forward orbital speeds of both bodies suddenly and violently decelerated. Saturn was pulled forward out of alignment with its companion planets. Simultaneously, Jupiter was pushed backwards onto a wider orbital ellipse. Their charge sheets intersected like soap bubbles merging, and a conjoined plasmasphere instantaneously formed to include both bodies. Thus, the Mesoamerican mytho-historical record reminds us, then, at the time of the second creation, Saturn was seized by Jupiter. In Hesiod, Zeus dethroned Kronos by throwing him off his chariot, likewise bringing Saturn to a crashing halt. Various peoples witnessed the events and described them as a celestial human drama in different forms. In each instance, a single pattern of events is present: the overthrow of a reigning king and father of the gods by a son whom the father has previously exiled or sought to destroy. Mutually mismatched charge potentials conducted an exchange of electrons across Jupiter and Saturn's shared electric field, instantly inducing an explosive battery of gigantic interplanetary thunderbolts spanning millions of miles. While the actual close encounter would not have lasted very long, worldwide descriptions strongly suggest considerable violence was involved. In Hesiod's description, a sudden surge of energy inspirited Zeus, and he exerted all the strength he had, sending flash after flash of continuous lightning. The bolts flew thick and fast from his powerful hand, whirling a solid roll of awesome flame. As recalled on the other side of the world, when Saturn was seized, his head was wounded, his face was buffeted, he was spit upon. Electrically disrupted by this close encounter with Jupiter, Saturn became unstable and exploded, flaring as a nova. In the wake of this electrical flare-up, a tumult of pulverized particulates began to surround Saturn in massive toroidal belts of spinning debris. Some of this material was likely expelled from Saturn, some of it likely excavated or sputtered from the surface of the moons and moonlets that still orbit among the rings. In Scandinavian lore regarding the end of the Golden Age, the celestial mill revolving in the sky above Earth's North Pole churned out first gold, then salt, then sand and stones, before it finally sank into the sea. The Greeks specifically associated Kronos with blizzards of snow and hail, remembered as the planet god's weapons at war. The theme of Saturn being tied up or put in these chains specifically by Jupiter was also recalled globally. In Platonic lore, Kronos was put in chains by Zeus to restrain his boundless course and to bind him in the network of the stars. At the same time, it was said, Zeus also surrounded himself in bands and belts. In placing bonds about his father, he at the same time bound himself. By these means, Zeus bound himself subject to his own laws as well. This episode of the Jupiter-Saturn myth has of course been subsequently verified, first by telescope and later by robot videography. Saturn is indeed in chains and fetters. Jupiter is indeed shrouded in bands and belts. Surely, in distant times, these two great bodies must have been much closer to the Earth for their physical attributes to be so vividly and prominently presented in early myth.